Welcome, everybody. Nice to see you here. Quite a big audience, I see. Nearly 400 here. Wow. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat box. So I'll try and answer things as they come up if you want to make remarks or ask questions. But of course, with such a lot of people, I don't know if I'll be able to keep up with it. So if there's anything that I haven't managed to answer, at the end of the presentation, I will give you my email so you can email me personally and ask. And of course, we'll leave time for questions, which Brigitte will organize. So 20 tips on teaching vocabulary. And I asked you to answer a few questions at the beginning of this session, those of you who came in earlier. And they related to these questions, basically. How many times do you need to review? Whether you teach American or British or a combination. Whether you should pre-teach vocabulary when you're teaching a reading text. Whether you should ask students to guess meanings of new words from context. Whether you should review in context, out of context. How much you should use word games, and so on, using L1. And Brigitte, can you just show the results of the poll on the screen? And we'll see where we are. So how many times? Most people said more than 6 times you need to review. What about which vocabulary is better to teach, American or British? People voted for both, depending on the goals of the course. Should you pre-teach vocabulary? Not necessarily, most of you said. Should you ask students to guess new words in a text from context? The large majority said yes, usually. Should you review new words in context or or isolation? Most people voted for in context. Word games, sort of mixed responses there. And should we use the L1? The majority think as little as possible. Okay, can you take it off and back to the screen, please, Brigitte? I'll be relating to all of these. Some of them I agree with the majority, sometimes I agree with the minority. And you'll see where we go. So let's start off.
Penny, you'll have to activate your camera again now. Otherwise we can't see you.
Thank you for reminding me. Yes, you're quite right. And you have to remind me next time when we have the one later on as well. So tip number 1, can you see me now? No, it's gone off again for some reason. Tip number 1 is simply to spend a lot of time, class time vocabulary teaching. We used to spend a lot of time on grammar, at least I did. And today, we realize that most of the meanings in language are conveyed by vocabulary, and therefore we really need to spend a lot of time on vocabulary. Because the students need to know a huge amount of vocabulary in order to communicate effectively, and they don't usually just pick it up automatically. When I first started teaching, I remember the inspector, the local inspector of English, came to me and said, don't bother to teach vocabulary, just teach them the grammar and they'll pick up the vocabulary as they go along. Well, that is totally not true. And I learned it the hard way. I learned that you really do need to teach vocabulary because otherwise they really won't learn enough just from incidental acquisition. The amount research says about B1 level, you need about 3,000 words or word families, goes up to 5,000 words at B2 and at least 8,000 for academic studies, which is an enormous amount. Doesn't really mean much, it's just numbers, but it does mean a lot. Okay, so you do need to spend a lot of time teaching. Learning new vocabulary by picking it up, as I said, is not very effective. The research shows that it's amazingly slow. You pick up something like 1 word per 1,000 read, and our students don't really read that much, do they? They don't read that much in their mother tongue, let alone in English. So you can't rely on extensive reading, although extensive reading is an important backup and the more advanced the students get, the more important extensive reading becomes. So that means teaching a lot of vocabulary lessons and reviewing it, which I'll come back to later. In fact, I'll come back to it immediately. Review again and again. And the research shows these numbers. So those of you who said more than 6 times, you are absolutely right. We need to encounter a word 6 to 16 times in order to remember it. It's not enough just to teach a word once and then walk away. Review as many times as you can. You probably can't review every single new item you teach. Review it 6 times. That's probably not possible, but as much as you possibly can, bearing in mind that the more the merrier. And they will, of course, encounter some of the words incidentally without your meaning deliberately to review them. But the more you review them in class, the better. Okay, let's move on. Useful routines for reviewing. I'm really, my thing is practical classroom teaching. I'm not really a research or theory person, so I always go into this practical stuff. Useful routines then remind students at the end of the lesson of vocabulary they learned earlier. So it's really useful to teach new vocabulary at the beginning of the lesson and then come back to it at the end and remind them. And then start the next lesson by challenging them. How many of the words we learned last time do you recall? And reminding them of the ones which they may have forgotten. And then cumulative review sessions and vocabulary quizzes to review later. Tip number 3, remember to teach multi-word items, or what's called chunks. There's all sorts of ways of calling them, I'll tell you in a moment, not just single words. They're called, in the literature you find phrases or lexical phrases or chunks or lexical chunks or expressions, etc. There's lots and lots of words for them. But what it means is things like, of course, or by the way, or by and large, now and then, and all the phrasal verbs, of course, and what's called binomials, things like willy-nilly and out and about, a combination of 2 words. Note that you could not in many cases, in fact most cases, guess the meanings of these multi-word items by knowing the meaning of the single words that make them up. They're not what's called compositional. So if you know get and you know on and you know with, this doesn't reveal to you what the meaning is of get on with. And the same goes for all the other items on your screen. And it's about 10% of the vocabulary students need to know. It's a lot. And sometimes the course books don't pick them up and you need to look for them yourselves. Tip number 4, which is linked to the previous one, the combinations of words. It's when you teach a new word, it's very useful to teach the words which it goes with. Just to answer Julia's question, revealing mean active production or just passive understanding? I'll come on to word searches later, but either and both, Julia, is the answer to that. Most video exercises tend to be receptive, but it's important also to include the productive. So collocations then. So when you teach angry, it makes sense to teach also with, angry with. Because in German, probably when their mother tongue, the preposition that goes with angry is not necessarily mit, right? It might be something else. I don't know what it is. You'll write it in the chat box and tell me in a moment. Afraid with of, because otherwise they'll say afraid and another preposition coming from their mother tongue. Similarly, teach them the difference between tall and high. They mean basically the same thing, but they collocate differently. They go with different things. Fast and quick also collocate with different verbs or nouns. And similarly, the adverbs which go with verbs like sleep soundly or work hard, and adverbs that describe adjectives dead could go with right, but not dead correct. So that's at a much higher level, of course. But it's useful when you're teaching a new word, bottom line, to teach the words it usually goes with. And we're coming on now to my question about American and British. And in my view, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that the word or expression will be understood by other people using English as an international language. And this may be British, it may be American, it may be a combination. The main criterion is its internationality, as it were. And that's why I should choose particular items. Let's look at this list here. Given that you accept my criterion, that internationalism is the most important thing, which would you teach of these pairs of alternatives in the list on your screen? You can write in the chat box or just think to yourself. You don't need to write it in. I'll be going through them in a moment. Yes, okay, 2 weeks rather than yes. Wallet, certainly, rather than yes. Wallet, autumn, fall. There seems to be various opinions on this. Do you have rather than have you got? Okay, fortnight. Okay, thanks. Keep going. And meanwhile, I'll tell you what I think. Fortnight, 2 weeks, I would say 2 weeks is a priority. I remember going to the States once and saying I was going to be there for a fortnight. I didn't know what I meant. A fortnight is simply not understood in places where people tend towards American English, whereas 2 weeks is understood internationally. So that's definitely a better choice there. Billfold and wallet. Billfold is very, very localized to the States. And wallet is the international one. Fall and autumn. Autumn is international. Fall is only American. It's almost not used outside American English and outside American informal English, come to that. Autumn is used in American formal English. For example, let's take the quarterly, TESOL Quarterly, which some of you may know. It has 4 issues: winter, spring, summer, and autumn. Although it's an American publication, but they use autumn as the formal term for that season of the year. So autumn is a better choice. Program. I was brought up in England, as you can hear from my accent, I expect. And I always used to spell program double M-E at the end. But in recent years, I've been spelling it with 1 M simply because it's quicker and easier to type. And it is more used internationally. Do you have you got? British published textbooks very often still teach have you got in their earlier units. And I don't know why, because do you have is much, much more common. And also, of course, it's much easier to conjugate. You can use it in the past and the future, whereas have you got is really only in the present. And finally, what's called tag questions. It's here, isn't it? I used to spend a lot of time in class teaching. He can come, can't he? We should, shouldn't we? And so on, all these tag questions. And really, in most conversational English, people tend to say, use just no or right or yes or quick things like that. So I wouldn't bother. A useful tool when you're trying to decide which is the, yes, Tanya, have you got is still taught at schools in Germany because they're mostly using British materials. And as I said, a lot of British materials still focus on have you got. I don't know why. I hope they'll move on to do you have. It's much more useful internationally. Mitchell, program, yes, okay, but even program for official plans, even there internationally, the spelling is often used for everywhere. I'll just introduce you to a very useful tool if you're wondering which to use, and that's a corpus of global web-based English. which I've given you the reference at the bottom there, and you will be getting this PowerPoint presentation. You'll be able to check later if you want to look up any of these references. And you can go into this corpus, and it'll tell you where a particular item is more used and where it's used less. For example, billfold and wallet. The headings in the light blue row at the top there are the different countries. So it begins with US, which is US, obviously, CA, Canada, GB, Britain, IE, Ireland, AU, Australia, and so on. And the columns show the amount that it's used. So billfold, you see, is used almost exclusively in US and HK, which is Hong Kong, whereas wallet is used all over the place. And in total, there's a lot more volume of columns, light blue columns, showing that it is in fact used a lot more overall. Have you got, same thing, you see that at the top there, do you have is far more widely used. It's just simply a lot more volume of light blue columns, so it's used a lot more. Have you got is used a lot less, and where it is used, it's mainly in the British English areas. Yes, Australian English, mix of American and British. Yeah, Australian tends to be slightly more British, but as you say, it also mixes in American quite a lot. Okay, moving on. Tip 6, reading text. You don't always have to pre-teach vocabulary, which I think most of you agree with me about. The thing is that if you teach 10 or 12 new words immediately before reading a new text, they probably won't remember what they mean long enough to be able to identify them and understand them when they meet them in the upcoming text. So there is also some evidence that teaching vocabulary during and after, rather than before, encountering it in text, brings about better learning. If you want any references, which I haven't given incidentally, please write and I'll send them to you. So if you pre-teach, it's important to teach only a few key items, if you can, in a previous lesson, so you've got time to review before you actually embark on the text, and it's more likely that you'll remember them. It's fine, it's perfectly okay to teach the new items as they come up. Ah, yes, I forgot to say, Brigitte, thank you. You'll get a handout, a PDF, which includes all of this presentation and all the references. It's fine to teach the items as they come up without pre-teaching. If you teach them as you are going through the text, it's in a meaningful context. It immediately contributes to their understanding of the overall meanings of the text. And of course, it's really, really important to review later. Yes, Margot says, I always let them read the text and highlight the words which they can't make anything of. Yep, that's one possibility. Another one is to highlight all the ones they do understand, which is perhaps a bit more good for the morale, and just leave unhighlighted the ones they didn't, so you can check those later. Anyway, that's just a quick tip. Tip 7, don't usually ask students to guess words from context. And this is where I don't agree with the majority. And I know that I'm being unpopular with this tip, but I think it's the research certainly backs me up. In most cases, if you ask students to guess a word from context, they get it wrong. I'll show you in a moment what I mean. They get frustrated, they have a feeling of failure, and they don't learn anything. So why do it? Just wastes time. Okay, over to you. Here's 5 missing words in an authentic text. See if you can guess any or all of them. Note down, not in the chat box this time, just note down on a piece of paper, or just think about in your mind what you think the missing words are. And I will leave you a little bit of time to think about it. Okay, are you guessing? Takes a little bit of a while. Guessing meaning from context is a life skill, yes. It's useful. I'll come back to where it's useful in a moment. My point here is that what I'm trying to show you is that it's very, very difficult in most natural, authentic texts to inference the word. So, okay. Can I carry on? You ready? Okay. Greta, can you show the questions, please, about how much they managed to guess? Will you write in on this form how many you got right? Oh, wait, I haven't shown you the, sorry. Here's the, sorry, my mistake. Have a look at the answers here and then say how many you got right. For some reason, I haven't made the possibility of 0, but there is a possibility also of 0, of course, which you can say. Yes, Julia says not many. Wouldn't it be enough if the word made sense? Yes, for reading, Jürgen, but not if your goal is to teach vocabulary. If your goal is to teach the correct meaning of a word, then no, it wouldn't be enough. Christina, 0. Yeah, you're in good company, Christina. Okay. Okay, can you close that down, Brigitte? We'll go back to the... what turns out is that most people did not guess most of the words. On average, and this is what the research also shows, on average, fewer than 50% of the words of any given text, content words I'm talking about, not the grammatical words, content words, are in fact guessable from context. Not usually very reliable, and there's plenty of research to back up what I'm saying, apart from the experiment we just did. So bottom line, ask students to guess only if you're fairly sure they can do so successfully. Now, guessing from context is, as you say, a life skill. It's a useful thing to do for reading comprehension, and when the teacher is not there to help you, then you're thrown back on your own resources, and very often you do need to guess from context. You don't want to stop every time, look it up in a dictionary. And there, guessing for your own extensive reading is really important. And it can give you the general gist of a piece of text. But if you want your students to know what the meaning of a particular word is, and you want to know the precise meaning, it's usually unreliable to ask them to guess. And it makes more sense just to explain and move on, and confine your requirement to guess only to those situations where you're pretty sure they'll be able to get it right, because the context does give enough clues. Tip 8, use online profiles to help you decide which vocabulary to teach from a text. You can't teach all the new vocabulary, or I don't think you should necessarily. You need to teach the items which are most important, and usually the ones which are most common and frequent. How do you know, however, which are most common? So I can't keep up with the questions here. I'll ask Brigitte to tell me the interesting ones at the end. How do you know which is most common, which are most important to teach? Partly your own professional judgment, and partly a tool called vocabulary profiles, which some of you may know about and some of you may not. They're online tools like these 3 here, which enable you to copy paste a text into the tool, and then it will tell you how frequent the different words are. So, for example, let's take LexTutor as an example. You can check these out later when you look at the handout. Here I've put in the first part of the text I showed you before. Yes, Julia, the Macmillan Dictionary Online might be also gives frequency. That's true. The Good Learner dictionaries also give frequency, but this tool actually tells you how frequent a particular word is. So here when you click on whatever it tells you to click on, you get something like this, where the blue words are K1, the first top 1,000, the most frequent one, sort of A1 level. K2 are the second 1,000, about A1, A2-ish, and so on. As the colors get warmer, it gets less frequent and more difficult. So if you have a word which is like, for example, lags, which is K5, which is very infrequent, it's a very advanced word, you might decide, I'm not going to bother to teach them this word. I'll tell them what it means for the sake of the understanding the text, but I won't test them on it and I won't review it. It's not so important as words like globally, consumers, addiction, and so on. But it depends, of course, on the level of your students. It makes sense to teach the most common ones. Mitchell says, so a gap text, a vocabulary text is a pure evil. No, it's not. Nothing is a pure evil. Even if they've practiced the words and practiced using context, then using gap text is lovely. But that's after you've taught them, Mitchell. You said they've already taught them. I'm talking about a situation where they didn't know the words and you're asking them to guess what they mean from context. Tip 9. Can this tool differentiate between different meanings? So no, it can't. And it also can't provide you with chunks or multi-word items. So that was a very good question. Thank you very much for asking that. It's a fairly crude tool, but it does help, and it's very quick and easy to use. Tip 9 is okay to practice words out of context as well as in. Most of you said yes, both in and out of context, which is what I want to say here. I was always told as a teacher, always practice a word within a sentence or within a text, and that's not true. Anyway, there's very few cases where I would say never or always in anything in language teaching. You don't always have to contextualize in full sentences, and it does slow you down a lot. So if you want to get through a lot of review of words, insisting on having them within full sentences every time is going to slow you down a lot, and it makes sense to review them at least some of the time, singly or in phrases. So, for example, here's my practical bit again, recalling. I mentioned before, how many of the items I taught last lesson can you recall? How many of the items we've learned in the last month can you recall? Translation, how many of these words can you translate? I'll come on to L1 later. Dictations or translation dictations, saying the word in German, ask them to write down in English, or vice versa. Identifying the odd one out. Yes, no, which means giving them a whole set of words on a page and asking them to tick the ones they recall and ask you the ones they don't recall. Words in phrases. So, for example, what adjectives could you apply to the word question? You want to practice question, you want to practice in context. What adjectives could you apply to it? Or how many phrases can you think of using the word under, and so on. Tip 10, make exercises interesting. A lot of interest exercises, though important to do, both grammar and vocabulary, they're sometimes boring, and there are simple exercise strategies that can make vocabulary exercises more interesting. For example, here we go. Here's a gap fill exercise with a bank of words, which I'm sure you've experienced things like that. And okay as far as it goes, and it practices the target items for a beginner class, but not particularly interesting. You can make it more interesting by doing various things. For example, delete the word bank. Do it once in the original way, and then ask them to fill in the gaps with using different words. So you're actually reviewing different vocabulary. You've reviewed the target vocabulary already, but you're also inviting them to add other things and say, using different vocabulary, which also makes it a lot more interesting. It also, incidentally, makes it a lot more adaptable for different levels, because more advanced students can add more advanced items and less advanced ones can add simpler ones. So it comes out like this. Or you can delete part of the root sentence, give them the answer, but ask them to make different context for it. So it comes out like this. So they can say whatever they like. And again, it's heterogeneous. It allows for different levels, and it's still targeting your target items. Personalize. So instead of the subject at the beginning of the sentence, you put in I and ask them to express their own ideas. Makes it more interesting. And finally, extend, adding a conjunction to the end of the sentence. So Mary likes eating ice cream when, and so on. And they have to add when, they think, or because, or but, or and it gives an opportunity to express more, contextualizing the target items, but a bit more interesting than the original. Are there recommendable sources for teaching collecting chunks, phrases? Johanna, you'll have to write to me about that. I haven't got them on this presentation, but I have some certainly, so write to me later. Basically, what makes exercises more interesting is if you make them open-ended, lots of possible right answers, which is what I did with this exercise you just saw. And the open-ended exercises are immediately more creative. They usually, or very often, have funny answers, so you get humor. They're unpredictable. They use very often higher order thinking skills, creative or logical or critical thinking. And you can add personalization as I showed you. Tip 11, avoid word games like hangman and word search. I haven't got time to play hangman with you at the moment, but if I did, I could demonstrate to you that you only spend the last 2 seconds of a minute or two of guessing actually engaging with the target word, and all the rest of the time you are just guessing letters and not learning very much. They're mostly a waste of time for vocabulary learning. Same thing with word search. Students who are doing word search are spending more time searching than they are finding, and the time they're spending on fruitless searching is not learning rich. They're not learning very much. More time spent searching or wrong guesses than on finding. However, they are useful as time fillers, particularly if you have a class which is a bit rowdy or it's last thing on a Friday afternoon and they haven't got the strength to go on with active learning. So they're useful as time fillers or to keep a class busy, but they do not teach very well and they shouldn't be used very much, except, as I say, for time or, as Karen says, a good brain break. Wordle, same thing. Same thing, Marianne, you're spending most of your time guessing and only the last couple of minutes you're actually targeting the word which they want you to play. Vivka makes an important point here. I like hangman when teaching the alphabet. Hangman is useful if you're teaching not just the alphabet, you're teaching the names of the letters, because most of the time is spent saying names of lessons. So it does make sense to use hangman for teaching letters, but not for teaching words or teaching spelling, because for that, you're not spending very much time on the target learning. Use L1 as well when introducing the meaning of a new vocabulary item. Lots of ways of including a new vocabulary item. All of these. I won't spend much time, so I'll go into them in a moment. Picture makes a lot of impact, but it may be ambiguous, and also, of course, not all items can be depicted. But look at this, for example. You're teaching happy, and you show them this. They may understand that it means happy, but they may also understand that it means smile or smiley or face. If, however, you add a translation, then it means that they get the impact of the picture, plus you're sure they've understood the meaning. So it's a win-win situation. Realia and mime are also very good for impact, better even than a picture. But again, they may be ambiguous, and again, not all items can be explained. Synonyms, yes, quick, but only you can use it at higher levels when they've got enough vocabulary to know synonyms. Again, they may be inaccurate or rough. Explanations, the problem with explanations is that they take much more time. They're for higher levels. They provide for added exposure to English and listening comprehension and so on, but they take a lot of time and they may not be clear. Have a look at this explanation of disappointed. Okay, you explain it in English. They may or may not understand it. What happens in class very often is that someone calls out the L1 translation. Everyone breathes a sigh of relief and you move on. And it might have been better just to give them the translation from the beginning. Examples can explain some general terms. You're teaching superordinates of some kind, like furniture, or a adjective like sweet or sport, where you can give examples and that will illustrate what the word means. But not everything is easily, obviously, explained by examples. Use in context. The advantage is that it gives the knowledge of the sentence context and more exposure to English, but again, may not clarify the meaning. If you see these context for exact, they may not know that what you mean is the word exact. It's not clear enough from the context. And we're on to translation. Translation is usually accurate, pretty accurate. It's not absolutely, but in most cases it's near enough. It's quick, it's very natural. On the whole, if I'm learning a new word in my second language, it really helps me if I know what it means in my first, and it's an intuitive thing which most of us do. Look for the meaning in our mother tongue. And so the bottom line, I would say, is not just use translation, but use pictures, explanation, context, examples, synonyms, and so on, backed up by a quick translation, and you're into win-win. You've got it both ways. You've got the added exposure, you've got the impact, you've got the context, but the translation will ensure that they've got the idea what the word actually means. Clara, we're not always allowed to use L1 in introducing vocabulary in class. Yes, it's a pity. I know some schools don't like it. Some employers or your superiors don't like it. I think it's desirable and useful in combination with other strategies, and you use it or you don't use it in a particular context according to what you are able to do. But if you are free to do so, use translation freely together with the other strategies. And don't feel guilty about it. Some teachers feel awfully guilty about using translation. I don't know why, but there it is. Tip 13, avoid teaching lexical sets altogether for the first time, like colors or parts of the body. A lot of elementary material is based on lexical sets because they're very convenient to teach and convenient to make exercises for. But the evidence is that teaching lists of words like this not very good learning, and it's much better to teach items that will naturally co-occur, in a given context. So, for example, not blue plus red or blue plus red, yellow, green, but blue with something like sky, which it would go with naturally, or green grass and so on. So not if you're teaching about the family or home, not just teach members of the family like a vertical list, but rather all sorts of words that have to do with family and home, including verbs, adjectives, adverbs, chunks, and so on. Tip 14, don't spend ages checking vocabulary homework exercise in class. Actually, it's not just vocabulary. Don't take ages checking homework in class. I remember looking at observing lessons and seeing teachers who spent half the lesson checking the last night's homework and only had half the lesson left to do whatever they'd planned to do. And it's an awful waste of time. If they've done a vocabulary exercise at home, it makes sense to try to avoid going through item by item in class, but use other strategies, like, for example, if it's a closed-ended exercise with answers you know, provide the answers on the board and let them check themselves, or let them check each other and just call you over if they need help with particular items, but don't bother to go through every single item. Best, of course, is to take in their notebooks and check them at home, or the digital equivalent. Not all of us have time because you have a heavy teaching schedule and a lot of students in the class. You can't do this so often, but as many times as you can, the more, the better, because then that way they will get your personal attention and you're not wasting time in class. Tip 15, get students to present new vocabulary. Something like word of the day. Ask the students, go home, choose a word you think nobody knows, or an expression or a phrase or a proverb, and come back and teach everybody. And it's quite fun. It only takes a few seconds at the beginning of the class or at the end of the class. It enriches their vocabulary and involves them. Word of the day, phrase of the day. Make sure you have a reserve yourself in case your student has forgotten to prepare, but it's a nice little strategy. Get students to design test items. If you want to test all the vocabulary we've learned over the last, I don't know, however often, get students to design questions themselves and then correct them if necessary, and then design the test based on what they've written. The advantages are, first of all, the test preparation is in itself review. If they're designing questions, they're reviewing the vocabulary. But also, it lowers test anxiety because they've prepared it, and it makes them feel a sense of ownership and makes the whole experience less frightening. Tip 17, prefixes and suffixes. It is conventionally assumed that these help. They don't help that much at elementary and intermediate levels because knowledge of the prefix and root doesn't convey the meaning of the word. But look at these words, for example, knowing the main word and knowing the prefix dis, the prefix re, and the suffix able will not reveal to you what the word means. And this is true of most common words, most words within the first couple of thousand words. The exceptions, the only prefix and suffix that I would teach at an elementary sort of B1 level, certainly A1, A2, or even up to B1, would be the lys, the suffix which indicates an adverb, the er meaning a person who does something, and un meaning the negative. Otherwise, I wouldn't do this. I wouldn't teach them. More advanced classes, of course, it becomes more useful because they know more vocabulary, and it becomes more useful to know the affixes. or first coming. This is an article of my own, and I haven't corrected this. This PowerPoint, the article has actually come out, and if you want to see it, write to me and I'll send it to you. Encourage students to look for new vocabulary outside the classroom. I don't know why this isn't displaying properly. So looking at, oh, here we are. To read, obviously, easy books. To search for new vocabulary in what's called the linguistic landscape, in the street, on packaging, in advertisements. So I'm just looking for new words. And of course, YouTube. And finding out things online. Tip 19, we're almost there. Okay, I said 20 tips. Don't overuse the dictionary. I wouldn't ask them to use a dictionary in class. It's important for them to know how to use the dictionary on their own, so they need to know dictionary skills. But in class, you are probably the best dictionary for them because you know the meaning they look for. You're fast, quick, accurate, and user-friendly. So yes, dictionary outside the class. Yes, a dictionary if you want to teach them dictionary skills. But if they simply want to know the meaning of a new word in a lesson, don't send them to dictionary. Just tell them what it means and get them to use a dictionary for things they do at home. Tip 20, never say never, my final one. And it applies to all the tips I've given you up to now. There will be tips which I've given you which are not appropriate for you, don't work for you. Feel free to reject or adapt them. There may be situations where my tips don't help. Use selectively, adapt, and also feel free to reject, of course. So there we are. That's the end of my presentation. Here are the references. I see it has a reference still forthcoming. It's ELT Journal, and I will send it to Brigitte later, and maybe she'll be able to get it to you. Thank you anyway for your attention and participation. And Brigitte, do you want to mediate some questions? I didn't manage to keep up with everything, I'm sorry.
Yes, thank you.
500 participants, I see. Yes.
That's the article you mentioned. Is it that you're going to send me?
I will send it to you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Lovely. Thanks very much. And, there's some questions here. One I've found interesting, where it's guessing. All right, you said don't let them guess words from context, but what about if they're guessing based on other criteria, like Latin roots or, you know, something like that?
Morphology, of course, yes. The morphology can help the Latin or Greek roots or the prefixes or suffixes. It can also often be misleading. Bachelard has a very amusing article about this, where she says, for example, a student once interpreted in one of her classes a word like shortcomings. She interpreted as meaning brief visits. That sort of thing it can lead to misunderstandings. You have to be careful. But in some cases, the morphology can help. It's true. So that is certainly something which needs to be taken into account. The ideal, of course, is to use both the morphology and the context, but of those two, it's the context which is more important normally.
Do you encourage the use of monolingual dictionaries at an advanced level?
Not particularly. I think it's much quicker and easier to use the bilingual. I mean, when you teach, those of you who are native German speakers, when you want to look up a new English word, do you use a monolingual or bilingual dictionary? I would guess that most of you would use an English-German dictionary. It's quicker and easier.
Definitely. Do you usually stick to textbook vocabulary when you teach along a textbook, especially with younger students?
Yes, I usually do. I usually use the textbook as a basis and add things as they come up, or, you know, I might add something which I want to do from a different source, to use it to enrich the textbook, but I would use the textbook as a springboard, as a basic basis for my course, and then add to it as and when the spirit takes me, I suppose, or if the children want it, or suggest something, or something which comes up in a communicative task. Yes.
All right. What about mind maps? Somebody would like to know. Are they useful?
Ruth said students have to use a monolingual in Bavaria for the Abitur. Yeah. Like the previous question about they won't let me use translation in the classroom. Sometimes you're working under certain constraints and there's nothing you can do about it. But you know, I don't have those constraints, so I can recommend freely what I think is better, and you do what you can within your own context.
Another interesting question here. Wouldn't you say translating to L1, in our case German, is unfair to all the students whose L1 is not German? Like you get students from other countries that don't speak German at all. Yeah,
yeah. If you have a class which is very, very mixed, then of course you have to allow for that, and you can use L1 much less than you can in a class which is monolingual. If there's just a couple of students whose mother tongue is something else, then ask them to help each other, and or ask the other German students, the German-speaking students, to help them if they happen to share the language or can explain better. But the fact that you have a minority of students who are not German-speaking, the majority are German-speaking, does not mean you shouldn't use German at all. It just means you have to be more careful about it and allow for those students who do not share the mother tongue.
Oh, excuse me. Oh yeah, quite a few people wanted to know, what is more common, grade or mark?
Interesting. In general, the answer is grade. It tends to be more common.
All right, thanks a lot. Shall we perhaps move to Tanya? I suppose it's a word that teachers use quite a lot. So
yeah. Coming from Britain, my natural word, I tend to use mark, and then I correct myself and use grade because that's sort of more international.
I see. All right. Tanya, I think we have to move you to your. Hang on.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Great, thanks a lot. Thank you, Brigitte. Thank you, Penny. Yeah.
So I'll just say goodbye then. And thank you very much for listening, everybody. And you've got my email, so if you want to write to me, you can. And Brigitte will send you the handout. And I will make sure to send that article to Brigitte now as soon as I turn off my computer. As soon as I...
Lovely. Thank you so much, Penny. Okay. I'll do that. Thank you. All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, Penny. So, good evening, everyone. Sorry I couldn't join the beginning. I was having some connection problems, but please let me know if you can hear me okay. Is everything okay, Brigitte?
Yes, awesome. Wonderful.
Great. Perfect. So, just gonna... Okay. So, I will be talking you through the material that you can use to work on vocabulary, to improve your students' vocabulary, and more than that. So the best title that we have, skipping through. The best title to practice vocabulary is, without doubt, Vocabulary News. And Vocabulary News comes in two versions, one for the general English, for general English, and the other one is for business English. And here you can see the different levels that are available for this title. However, Vocabulary News is part of a bigger family, the eNews family, which includes a lot more than just vocabulary. It also includes grammar, titles to work on grammar, idioms, collocations, and phrasal verbs, pronunciation, and so on. And so these are our best. This is our best-selling series, and it has been so popular and so appreciated throughout so many generations because of its structure, because of the way it's presented, because of the way the language is presented, and the way the students get to practice the language. I'll show you an example what the inside of the book looks like. I am sure you're very familiar with some of these titles. Probably you've been using the English Grammar News and Vocabulary or Essential Grammar News, and that framework, that design, is replicated in the other titles too. So you know that when you're choosing a news, you are choosing, you know what you're choosing exactly. You know that the format is consistent. And we have some great news. We have the Advanced Grammar News coming up, the 4th edition coming up in April. And the book will come with online tests and the ebook. So there will be just one ISBN, and that will be, it will be bundled with the digital component. So, and there will be some short tests on Cambridge One, which is a new platform, all device-friendly platform, and these tests will give feedback on grammar. And so Cambridge One, of course, can be accessed via mobile phones, tablets, computers, and so on. So this is great for students that are always busy, on the go, or even for in-class practice. So this is the layout I was talking about. So on the left, you have the language is presented, the language is explained, there are clear examples, and then on the right you have the correspondent activities. So there is a cross-reference that students can do between the explanation and the practice. And as I said, so there is the ebook for all our most recent editions of the news family. And sorry, I have other things in the way. Okay. And don't forget the CLET Augmented app. So you can scan your page and you can listen to the audio, and also you can look up the definition of the grammar words. And then finally, we also have Penny's book. So the 77 tips for teaching vocabulary. And this is a concise but comprehensive presentation of what is drawn from Penny's experience, extensive experience, as well as insights from research in applied linguistics. You will find a wide range of topics that include introducing new vocabulary, reviewing and practicing new words and expressions, and also ways of expanding and enriching the learner's vocabulary. And you will also find some classroom illustrations and ideas to implement, which can also help you to teach vocabulary more effectively. So this is all from me. If you have any questions, you can ask me now, or you can email Brigitte, and we'll answer all your questions.